Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. It is 8 o'clock and we're about to get started. I think I'm going to give us 1 or 2 more minutes as there's still some people coming in, and then we'll officially get going. All right, well, thank you all for being here. I'm going to officially kick us off this morning. I am Beth Martin, a teaching professor at Washington University in St. Louis and co-focal point of the RINGO constituency. I appreciate you all being here for our key issues to watch at COP29 webinar. I want in particular thank my colleagues in RINGO and also Second Nature and UC3, the University Climate Change Coalition, for coming together to pull this webinar. Just a reminder, this is our third Key Issues to Watch webinar, and we also have 2 additional preparatory webinars on the RINGO website, and we can share that link in the chat. To get us going this morning, I'm going to turn it over to Anna McGinn, a RINGO steering committee member, to moderate our session. Anna is the policy director at the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, which is a nonpartisan profit based in Washington, D.C. that focuses on advancing science-based solutions for climate change. Anna organizes congressional briefings, reviews fact sheets, and tracks congressional efforts in the U.S. on climate, energy, and environment topics. And she's been tracking and attending UNFCCC COP since 2011. She has a dual master's degree from the University of Maine in climate and coordinatory studies, as well as global policy, and is also a graduate of Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. So Anna, I'm going to turn it over to you to move us along.
Thanks, Beth. And good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone who's joining us. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll echo Beth's thanks to Second Nature, University Climate Change Coalition, or UC3, and RINGO for coordinating and hosting today's webinar, Key Issues to Watch at COP29. We have a pretty busy schedule lined up for today. But before we jump in, just a couple of logistics to share with you. And I think we have a slide with a couple of those. We are going to have 5 presenters followed by a discussion. Here we go. One more slide, I think. Perfect. So get your questions coming in through the Q&A function, and we will keep track of those and get to as many of them as possible after the presentations. Also a note that we are recording this so that you can watch it as many times over as you need to prepare for going to COP or watching from afar, sharing it with your colleagues as well. And Q&A, as I mentioned, is the best way to be communicating with us because participants are on mute mode. Without further ado, I think we will jump right into our introductions for this morning. And I am going to introduce all 5 of our speakers at the same time, so bear with me. They all have very impressive resumes. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then they are going to hand the baton to each other as we go throughout the presentation. So our first presenter this morning is going to be Edda Kosma. She is an international fellow at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. Her work centers around international climate finance and transparency, including within the bounds of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiation process. Melissa Low will be our next presenter, and she's a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. At the center, Melissa leads continuing education and training. Our next speaker following Melissa will be Jhalak Aggarwal, who is a program associate for the International Cooperation Team at the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. Her research focuses on tracking Paris Agreement negotiations, post-2020 ambitions, developing indicators, and conducting assessments for capacity building associated with the Enhanced Transparency Framework. Danielle Falzon will be our next presenter. Danielle is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on examining power and inequities in climate-related decision-making, particularly around issues of adaptation and loss and damage. And last but not least, we will have Axel Michaelowa joining us, and he is the senior founding partner of Perspectives Climate Research and a part-time researcher at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Zurich. Axel specializes in international carbon markets and the design of domestic climate policy instruments. He's a founding member of the RINGO constituency group and has served on the board since that time. So without further ado, I think we'll jump right in and I will hand it over to Edda to get us started.
Thanks so much, Anna. So great. If we could just advance to the next slide. And I wanted, before we dig too deeply into the new collective quantified goal, or the NCQG as it's known, I wanted to just center us in some context for climate finance within the UNFCCC. So really, and many of you are probably aware already of the $100 billion goal, but to remind us, the $100 billion goal predates and is currently in place before the NCQG, but it was a goal that was set and pledged by developed countries and really set with political means and intentions at COP15 in Copenhagen. And there, developed countries committed to mobilizing jointly $100 billion per year by 2020 to address the needs of developing countries. It didn't really take into account the needs of developing countries, but at the same time, it was sort of the first climate finance pledge that was made. And I think one thing that we've talked about a little bit in the climate finance world this year is that there has been a glossing over of like the specifics around the 100 billion. And so there was a sort of ramp up period originally for the $100 billion goal that was known as Fast Start Finance, where developed countries sort of agreed that they would, again, mobilize and provide US or $30 billion between 2010 and 2012. And at COP18, it was acknowledged that those developed country parties did reach that goal, and they were urged to fulfill the rest of the pledge. We now know that, of course, those parties didn't meet the goal by 2020. And I think maybe there was a little bit of the writing on the wall there. So at COP21, with the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the $100 billion goal was extended to 2025. And ultimately, the OECD, which is the main body that's in charge of monitoring and the methodologies for assessing the $100 billion goal, they assessed that the $100 billion goal was met by developed country parties in 2022. There is a lot of background, of course, there, and that is also contested by some organizations and parties. I won't, we'll gloss over that a little bit so that we can focus more on the NCQG. But just to say that there are many lessons that can be learned from the history of the $100 billion goal, and it's something that continues to color the negotiations today. So important context to consider as we approached the new collective quantified goal. And I'd say a major takeaway is possibly making sure that the needs of developing countries are really incorporated into the new goal, but also whether or not parties trust that the pledged finance that developed countries have said that they will provide, whether or not that will be forthcoming. So we'll dig into the NCQG on the next slide. And really, just to remind us of some of the mandates. So again, in Paris, Decision 1, CP29, really sets out what the NCQG is to provide. So prior to 2025, parties were to set from a floor of $100 billion per year a new collective quantified goal that should also take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. So again, right there, we're already learning from the $100 billion goal. And then we sort of see the further aim defined of the NCQG in Decision 14 CMA1, or I should say the Conference of the Parties to the Meeting of the Parties to the Paris Agreement, the CMA. The NCQG deliberations should be considered with the aim to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So even there, we can see sort of many different readings of the mandate that could be taken from what the parties said at CMA1. But either way, parties decided at COP26 to agree, and they agreed to initiate the NCQG ad hoc work program in 2022. So well before 2025, that they wanted to go ahead and talk about and dig into the conversations around what that would look like. So if we go to the next slide, I put together a bit of a graphic just to show us what that ad hoc work program looks like. And so I think similarly learning from the lessons of the 100 billion, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the lack or with how the political agreement was placed. And so I think this might have been a reaction in some ways to allow the technical experts and also just parties to have more discussion around what the true needs of developing countries are. So that in COP26, parties decided to set forth an ad hoc work program that consisted of 4 technical expert dialogues per year, as well as 1 high-level ministerial dialogue. And over the course of 3 years leading up to a decision to be taken prior to 2025, so that put that at COP29 this year. So really what that means is that since 2022, there have been 11 technical expert dialogues, and there have been at minimum 3 high-level ministerial dialogues. There will have more high-level ministerials at COP, and we'll talk about that in a bit, as well as negotiations that have occurred at COP27, 28, et cetera. One thing I'll note too is that at COP28 last year, parties decided to also transition their mode of work to include a new modality for this year. And so in addition to the technical expert dialogues that occurred in the 3 quarters of this year prior, there were also meetings of the ad hoc work program, which were essentially party-driven negotiations that allowed the NCQG co-chairs to begin drafting the substantive framework for a draft negotiation text. So really that looks like consolidating and coalescing different options that have been identified throughout each of the 11 TEDs, and bringing that into something that looks more like decision text. So we have the last high-level ministerial dialogue, which took sort of throughout each of these technical expert dialogue processes. There have been elements that have been identified that have needed political discussion or political guidance. And so one of the last high-level ministerial dialogues was held on October 9th, just before the pre-COP. And their ministers were intended to sort of give some of that political guidance. But I think there still remains a lot to be discussed at COP29. So, and in the interest of time, I'll move us to the next slide where I just want to talk more about sort of like what actually will be in the NCQG. So I think in the finance realm, it's been described as maybe a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. These are just some of the elements that were identified of among the many at the beginning of the year for how could the NCQG begin to come together. And I won't spend too long here, but really this is just to demonstrate how many elements are in play with this decision. And if one element is changed, that often might also shift the calculus for other parties and affect what their positions might be for the rest of the elements. So it's been quite difficult, and I think important for the technical process to have been so comprehensive. So really over the course of the 3 years, parties and technical experts have explored some configurations. And just to note too, at the beginning of the year, I think I heard the statistic for the goal structure there being 70 options for that. I think we've now shifted to a place where there are a much more streamlined set of options around what might exist for all of these. But just to say that in the substantive framework for the draft negotiations text that the NCQG co-chairs have now published, you'll note that there are still many open brackets, and it's for honestly all of these elements, there really have not been any particular areas that have been settled yet. So I'll move us to the next slide, just so that we can dig into some of the key remaining issues. So of those elements, I wanted to focus on just these four, and so that we can look at a little bit in detail. But the goal structure is really where I think we'll see a lot of where you might hear a lot of focus from parties. It really comes down to how many layers might be in the goal, and so and what those layers are defined as, what the sources of finance that will be counted towards tracking progress towards the NCQG and the achievement of it. So I think to describe it most basically, so we have one option that's defined as, so there could be two layers. One of those would be a public finance provision goal, so grants and not highly concessional loans, as well as a second layer that might look like a mobilization goal. So what types of private finance and other sources of finance might be mobilized directly from that public finance. And then on the other side, you have sort of another two layers, and that might be both the provision and mobilization goals combined, which is essentially a replica of what's happening under the 100 billion, and a second outer layer, which has been kind of called like the global investment goal, or a global investment layer that sort of counts private sector finance more broadly. So it's really about the sources of finance that might be included or counted under the NCQG. But another really big question is who will actually contribute to the goal. So some parties will tell you that the NCQG should be decided in the context of Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement, in which parties, developed country parties, should lead the way towards the realization of a joint collective goal. But there are still some parties who are outside of the traditional annexes, like South Korea, who might give to the who have given to climate finance in years prior, but there is some resistance, of course, from other parties to be included in sort of in a formal way as a contributor to a new goal. So there are two sort of options on the table. In the latest text, there's an annex that sort of describes a situation in which parties might, by GNI or GNI per capita, be included sort of in the or encouraged based on those criteria to contribute to the goal, or there might be some sort of informal arrangement. But this is quite an important element for, in particular, developed country parties. So I wouldn't expect it to sort of go away anytime. And then the third element that I'll just touch on is that it's also being discussed in quite detailed terms what the time frame for the goal will be. So whether it should be a 5-year goal, a 10-year goal. There are also some calls for the goal to reach all the way to 2050. And so what does that look like? How will the goal actually be revised? So will there be sort of like a midway review point? These are sort of elements that are being considered. And then also there is a bit of a technical tie back, since there is with climate finance a significant reporting lag that is often experienced. And so and I know Melissa will talk more about the transparency frameworks, but the biennial transparency reports that parties will be reporting under, there will be a pretty significant lag there. I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll move us along. And so just to say too quickly on thematic subgoals, so there's also talk of subgoals for adaptation and loss and damage, whether or not those might be quantitative or qualitative, still unclear, but of course there is significant prioritization for adaptation, loss and damage among some parties. And You might notice that of this list, I've also like sort of left off quantum. Of course, that's sort of the biggest question is how much money will be ultimately raised. I want recognizing how long the technical process has been, the quantum has sort of remained and is understood to be the main political question. But it can really only be decided after these four elements have been discussed. Even though there is sort of a reluctance to talk about sequencing, since again, like each element after they're decided might shift the others. Quantum is sort of the big question that might remain a bit of a mystery. So just to go to my last slide, what might we expect at COP29? So yes, so following the really extensive 3-year process, it's sort of understood that the technical process has reached its limit. And so political engagement and guidance and decision and trade-off will be really important at the COP itself. From what I've heard, it really doesn't seem like there will be many negotiating sessions at the technical level for the NCQG. So I would expect to see a few contact groups. They might go very long, but I'd say it's going to be more important to see what the political level will tell us. There is a high-level ministerial dialogue for climate finance scheduled for November 14th per the overview schedule. But I would say it's pretty unlikely that we'll get to see behind those closed doors. But I'm curious to see how often we'll be hearing from the political level on any progress. And sort of to end, I think there is an understanding among parties that the goal, of course, must be ambitious. It needs to react to the needs of developing country parties that are now well known through sort of like the needs determination reports and others. But I think a growing understanding that the goal must also be achievable. So it really, we'll see what happens. But I think I'd expect to see something in the realm of the needs. So hopefully we'll see if $1 trillion is reached. But with that, I'll hand it to Melissa to talk more about transparency.
Hi. Okay, great. So moving along to the nationally determined contributions and biennial transparency reports. If you go to the next slide. So I'm just going to go over this briefly for those of you who are not familiar with nationally determined contributions, but for those of you who are, please indulge me for just a little bit. So the nationally determined contributions are really at the heart of the Paris Agreement, as well as towards the achievement of its long-term goals, including the temperature threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Specifically in the Paris Agreement, you see that Article 4, Paragraph 2 states that each party has to prepare, communicate, and maintain successive NDCs. Article 4, Paragraph 3 says that parties have to in terms of their successive NDCs, these have to represent progression, which technically means that they should be more ambitious, and there is generally a principle of non-regression applied here. Paragraph 9 of the same article says that the party has to communicate an NDC every 5 years, and seeing that the Paris Agreement first was adopted in 2015, entered into force in 2016, meant that the first round of NDC submission was at the time in 2015-16, followed by 2020, and the next round of NDC submission is actually next year in 2025. Now you'll see in Decision 1, CP21, Paragraph 25, it says that parties should be submitting their NDCs at least 9 to 12 months in advance of the relevant COP. So given that the next COP in Brazil is happening in November 2025, if you stick closely to this provision, it means that the NDCs are technically due in February of next year. But it remains to be seen whether parties will actually submit their NDCs well ahead of the COP. Article 4, going back to the Paris Agreement, Article 4, Paragraph 11, does state also that parties may adjust their existing NDC at any time if they wish to enhance its level of ambition. And when I was preparing this presentation, I went to check the NDC registry, which you can access at any time on the UNFCCC website. The last NDC submission was in October 2023 by the European Union as well as Azerbaijan. Some of you who have been observing the process will note that following the Glasgow COP26, I believe, parties were invited by the presidency of the UK to revisit and strengthen the NDCs, but only 20 odd countries did so. If you go to the next slide, the other key topic to look out for is the biennial transparency reports. So as some of you know, the BTRs are due for the first time this year. And these reports actually succeed the existing measurement, reporting, and verification arrangements, which I'll come to later. But just to say that under the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement contained in Article 13, parties are required to submit these new biennial transparency reports every 2 years, starting this year. And this is a shall mandate, which means that if parties do not submit the first BTRs this year, they will be in non-compliance of the Paris Agreement, which could trigger a notice from the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee under Article 15. So what does the BTR actually need to comprise? So here I've listed some of the modalities, procedures, and guidelines contained in Decision 18 CMA1, as well as its annex. So parties essentially have to submit a textual report. They also have to submit common reporting tables. We know this as CRTs. And this is for the purpose of electronic reporting of information on their national inventory reports. And these will be submitted as annexes to the textual report. Parties also need to submit common tabular formats for the electronic reporting of information necessary to track the progress made towards achieving the NDCs. So the BTRs, the biennial transparency reports, are really crucial in helping us understand whether countries are actually working towards making progress towards achieving the NDCs or not. Parties also, for those parties that are required to, they also need to submit information on their financial, technology development and transfer, as well as capacity building support that they've provided, mobilized. So for those who have provided these, they have to submit information on this. And countries that have said that they needed relevant finance, technology development, transfer, and capacity building, and have received it, they also need to submit this. So this is really new compared to what the existing MRV arrangements say. So this means that in terms of transparency, we're not just submitting transparency on action, but we're also submitting transparency on support. I should mention here also that if countries are using, or parties are using cooperative approaches such as Article 6.2, they will also need to submit a structured summary as part of the annual information as well. So here also, I highlight that Article 13, paragraph 7A suggests that each parties shall provide national inventory reports, as well as national inventory documents, as well as their common reporting tables. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is that for many developed countries, this is not particularly new for them. They have been submitting their biennial reports since 2014. As well as the national communication since that earlier as well. However, for many developing countries, you will find that there may be some difficulties, or they may have had to leapfrog from just the national communication or first or second reports of the biennial update reports to the biennial transparency reports, especially since this is a required mandate under the Paris Agreement. I should note also that as of October this year, the first biennial reports have already started to come in, and they've been submitted by Andorra, Guyana, and Panama. So you can also access that online via the UNFCCC website. I have one final slide. If you go to the next slide, it's just to say that transparency reporting under the UNFCCC is actually long-standing. This is not particularly new. However, the biennial transparency reports under the Paris Agreement is essentially meant to track parties' achievements of their NDCs. And while they are required this year, we will see, because as you know, the COP is happening from the 11th to the 22nd of November, but the BTRs are only due by the end of December, 31st of December, 2024. So parties may end up actually submitting their BTRs after the COP as well. And I should note also that, as I said, some parties had been submitting the biennial update reports and biennial reports. Some of these will be reviewed under the existing arrangements. So if you are tracking transparency at COP29, I suggest looking for the facilitative sharing of views, which is happening on the 15th of November. There are a number of countries presenting. Chile, Guatemala, Kyrgyzstan, and Peru are presenting at the 17th facilitative sharing of views. And a number of developed countries are presenting their final multilateral assessment workshop. And these include Australia, Belgium, Canada, Croatia, Hungary, Iceland, Japan, Kazakhstan, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Norway, Poland, Portugal, and Switzerland. Again, you can find all of this on the UNFCCC website. And that takes me to the end of the session on NDCs and BTRs. I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you for having me here today. So I'll be talking about the loss and damage and how the progress has been. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So loss and damage in general has been a very contentious issue for the last couple of years. It's been a debate that was sparked by the leadership of the ISS and who put forward their perspective 3 decades back. And now this has become the part of the larger agenda of the developing world as well. But before deep diving into the technical aspect, I would just like to quickly touch upon some aspects for all of us to become a little familiar with the key concepts and brush up on some basic understanding. So if you talk about loss and damage, there is no unified definition that we have as of now, but it's largely understood. It's largely understood as the unavoidable and the irreversible impacts that occur despite the adaptation and mitigation measures. If you talk about the differentiation between loss versus damage, so loss largely refers to the irreparable harm, and damage refers to the repairable aspect, something that can still be set right. There are largely 2 types of loss and damages. The first one being economic damage, which can be quantified, such as damage to infrastructure, homes, buildings. And the second aspect is non-economic loss and damage, which are basically difficult to quantify. And some example of this would be loss of biodiversity or loss of culture. So if I talk about the loss and damage conversation and how the conversation has really evolved over the past couple of years, it's been spoken from the largely from the lenses of climate justice and global solidarity. But it only became pertinent in the last couple of years. It wasn't until COP27 in 2022 that loss and damage even made it to the agenda. So at COP27, we saw that the fund was finally established, marking a little victory for the long-standing demand of the countries, especially the small island developing states and the least developed countries. To operationalize this fund, a transitional committee was also set up at COP27, and their mandate was largely to discuss and suggest some of the key recommendations on what the operational modalities would look like, basically how the fund will operate, what the goal would look like, and this had representation from both developed as well as the developing world. Post this, taking up these suggestions from the Transitional Committee, the Loss and Damage Fund was finally operationalized last year at COP28 in Dubai. And this was a historic decision that was taken on the first day of the COP last year. Under this decision, the draft governing and the decision-making structure was also set up, where there was a board and a secretariat that was set up, where the board would be the key authority and the decision-making body to supersede all the decisions. Post that, in the next slide, I'll be talking about some of the key developments that have taken over in the last over 1 year. We finally have a name of the fund. It's called the Fund for Responding to the Loss and Damage. And this can be seen in a positive light, given the suggestions that were made earlier. One of the suggestions was to call it the Resilience Future Fund. So this is a good thing. This is a positive decision that we have the phrase loss and damage in the fund. It's in the name itself. Philippines has also been chosen as the host country for the board. We also have an executive director in place, and we're expecting him to introduce himself and lay out his vision for the operation of the fund, as well as a secretary to the wider audience very soon and in the run-up to COP as well. We also have the World Bank that has been finalized as the trustee and the host for the fund secretariat. So this arrangement is actually interim initially for the first 4 years, but this could become permanent, and it's dependent on the evaluation that will happen of the next 4 years at COP 2023. So the World Bank has kind of agreed and accepted the invitation to host the fund, and it also met the set of conditions that were laid down earlier to ensure that the fund operates as an independent fund, and the board has all the power to make the funding decisions as well as decide on the operational policies. So this fund is not a part of the World Bank, but is a larger part of the funding mechanism of the UNFCCC and the larger Paris Agreement. Can you please move to the next slide? Yeah. So despite some of these developments, there are some key issues that are largely unanswered, and these are largely on the aspects of what the funding scale would look like, what the operational model of the fund would look like, and what are some of the access policies that the countries can use to access this fund. So the first question is on who pays. So there's a little bit of ambiguity over there. While it's largely stated that the developed countries are expected to take the lead in providing resources for commencing the operationalization of the fund, but this is not the same as them providing regular pledges to ensure that the fund's financial future is secure. So there's a little bit of ambiguity over there. We're also a little unclear about who would receive the fund, while there's a larger understanding between the developing world that all developing countries should be the recipients. But there are narratives which suggest that maybe different countries whose economic realities have changed can also be donors to this, but this largely remains decided. How much money the fund will be able to provide also remains a key question. So during the transitional committee meetings, the developed countries had actually suggested 100 billion as the floor for the fund, but a new research has come up and the need seems to be much higher, but there is no quantum that's been decided as of now. The access modality is basically we have some money in the fund as of now, but how the countries or the communities, the national entities can access this remains largely unclear, and there are discussions and deliberations that we're expecting for it to happen. Another key issue is that how the financing would move forward. If you look at the current finance architecture, it remains, it clearly shows that it's kind of insufficient, be it in terms of the quantity. So currently the fund has 660 million, but the demand that we currently have is in billions. So how can we rope in other actors to actually deliver on this? What the quality of the finance would look like? If you look at the decision text, it talks about grants and highly concessional loans. But what these highly concessional loan mean is a little unclear, whether this would be at the market rate or what this would look like. So this is something that we're also expecting to be discussed in the coming few days. And lastly, the discussions on the resource mobilization strategy has been postponed to 2025. And this is something which is of a key concern and key importance as well, as this will set the stage and the tone for what the long-term funding strategy would look like to provide the finance for loss and damage. So given this background, if you look at COP29, there are a couple of expectations that still lie. And the first one is to ensure the full operationalization of the fund. We see that the disasters are rising both in terms of intensity and frequency, and it's completely imperative and important for the fund to truly deliver on this as soon as possible. Also, a little clarity on some of the operational modalities, such as who would pay, who would receive, and how this fund would reach the local level is also very critical, and this is something that the deliberation on this are expected to happen. Also, as I mentioned earlier, that the current pledges make up for only 0.2% of the needs of the developing countries. So it would be nice for the COP29 presidency to call for greater and ambitious support under the L&D. They've also listed operationalization of this loss and damage fund as one of the critical pillars under the enabling action. And lastly, COP29, as Ed also spoke about earlier, is being called as a finance COP. And we hope that this can also be mirrored for the loss and damage finance by either recognizing loss and damage as an important thematic focus or having it as a sub-goal under the NCQG. So this will not only reiterate the need for much higher loss and damage finance, but also expand the focus and the ambition. And lastly, the third review of the Wars International Mechanism, which is the larger framework for loss and damage action and support. The review of this is also expected to be finalized. So this is also an important opportunity to strengthen the Warsaw mechanism's role and enhances coordination with other important entities with the Santiago network, which is a technical arm, and also the newly created fund. So it'll be important and interesting to see how the definite clear criteria is being set and how they can come together to facilitate both the technical as well as the financial assistance. So with this, I'll stop here and I'll hand it over to Danielle.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to be presenting a little bit on the global goal on adaptation discussions, which have been ongoing for a few years. Next slide, please. So the global goal on adaptation was established in the Paris Agreement in Article 7.1. So it reads, parties hereby establish the global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal. So, I mean, though this article outlines these three elements, enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability, it doesn't really elaborate on what those elements mean or how they should be assessed, how progress on them should be assessed over time in accordance with this goal. Next slide, please. So in 2021, the Adaptation Committee, which is a constituted body under the UNFCCC, they developed this technical paper that kind of reviewed the options for assessing progress on the global goal adaptation. And essentially they gathered a lot of literature and like a lot of ideas about how this could possibly be done. And it was, of course, the answer was that it was going to be complicated. And so this issue was taken up at COP26 in Glasgow. Next slide, please. And so in Glasgow, they established something called the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Work Program, or the GLASS Work Program, which was a 2-year work program to kind of decide how they would elaborate the global goal on adaptation as outlined in the Paris Agreement in order to assess progress on it going forward. I'm not going to read these 8 workshop titles, but they had 8 workshops where they sort of dealt with a number of issues about how progress would be assessed. One of the options that came up at the beginning, which not all parties were on board with initially, was the development of indicators, a set of targets and indicators with which we would assess progress on the global goal. Next slide, please. So fast forward to COP28. So the GLASS work program concluded at COP28, something that was sort of decided through the global goal and adaptation negotiations at the time and through the work program was that there would be a framework created for kind of dealing with the global goal and adaptation and dealing with all of the kind of logistical and decision-making elements of how progress would be assessed on it going forward. So parties adopted the UAE framework for global climate resilience at COP28 in Dubai. And I'll say more about what that includes in a moment. And the framework also launched another 2-year work program called the UAE BLM work program on indicators. So like I said, indicators were not necessarily predestined when the first work program began, but it has been something that parties have decided will be their approach to assessing progress going forward. And so the work program on indicators had 2 meetings in 2024, and we'll have an additional 2 meetings in 2025. And so it'll be formally concluded at COP30 in Belém. Next slide, please. All right, so there are a key element of the framework are these two sets of targets that parties generated. And so the first set of targets is thematic. The second part is dimensional, meaning based on the adaptation policy cycle. So the thematic targets are outlined in paragraph 9 of decision 2 CMA 5. If you could just click forward so you can see the thematic targets. Yeah. So these are the thematic targets, and then yes, and this is I sort of shorthanded the targets, and these are the more elaborated descriptions of the targets. But broadly, they refer to water, food and agriculture, health, ecosystems, infrastructure, poverty and livelihoods, and cultural heritage. Next slide, please. Then we have the dimensional targets, and if you could just click again, and like I said, these are aligned with the adaptation policy cycle. So these are impact, vulnerability, and risk assessment, planning, implementation, and then monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And so you can again see kind of the more elaborated versions of those targets. These two sets of targets were rather contentious in the negotiations and work program discussions previously because it's unclear. It was unclear initially how they would interact, and they're sort of still deciding how these two sets of targets would interact or be treated differently. Next slide, please. Okay, so how to actually develop indicators for these targets. This is the aim of the new work program on indicators that we're about halfway through right now. So there are many considerations that need to be made on developing indicators. One is the utilization of existing indicators, such as those used in the Sustainable Development Goals, versus developing new indicators. There's a question of qualitative indicators versus quantitative indicators, whether those indicators should indicate outputs, outcomes, or are more processual, maybe like policy development elements, how those indicators could include Indigenous and local knowledges. The question of data readiness is there data out there that could actually speak to the indicator or speak to the indicators, the different elements that they want to measure. And so to deal with all of these questions and to kind of coordinate how the indicator development would take place, they developed several expert groups. So there's one for each thematic target. Excuse me, there's a typo on there. One for each thematic target. And then there's one expert group for the all 4 adaptation cycle targets that were outlined in paragraph 10. And over the summer after SB 60, parties and many other stakeholders submitted indicators for consideration by the expert groups. There were 62 submissions, which amounted to 5,304 indicators, including 4,907 existing, 340 new, and 57 that are sort of unclear. This is a massive Excel file that you can actually download if you are interested in seeing all the indicators that that parties put forward. And there's they kind of have to categorize the indicators according to various criteria, including like qualitative versus quantitative, how they interact with other thematic targets and dimensional targets, etc. The expert groups reviewed the proposed indicators that related to their targets and presented sort of a update about their kind of stock taking of those indicators at the second work program on indicators workshop in October 2024, so just a few weeks ago. Next slide, please. Just to give you a broad sense or like a quick sense of what some of their presentations indicated, you can see in the graph on the left that there were many targets mapped to each indicator, but like, for example, you can see there the cultural heritage indicators 9G, there were relatively far fewer indicators that were proposed. You can see in the kind of pie charts on the right. This is just an example taken from, or 2 examples taken from the expert group's update presentations, that for water, they were seeing, they were kind of having trouble categorizing indicators between output, outcome, and processual indicators. You can see output indicators of the three that are actually categorized. Output indicators are the most common, which are sort of a problem because outputs are sort of like counting the number of meetings, for example, that were included as part of an adaptation project, or the number of like pamphlets that were distributed, something like that. Whereas outcomes or processual indicators kind of speak to more substantive interventions. And then you can see in for food and agriculture, thematic target 9B, that there were far more quantitative indicators. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's being cut off, but there's far more quantitative indicators, which is the light green, than qualitative indicators that they were finding. Essentially, the expert groups sort of gave the lay of the land and showed that this is still extremely messy. The indicators and the information on them that they were given is extremely messy, and they're going to have a lot of work ahead of them. Next slide, please. So what to expect at COP29? There will for sure be discussions on further guidance for the expert groups and plans for the 2025 work program on indicator workshops. So one of the issues that came up in the recent workshop was with the expert groups is that there isn't really a clear methodology that has been laid out to guide expert group work. And there were concerns expressed by the various expert groups that they were working in different ways, and there wasn't clear mechanisms for them to coordinate, because of course some of these indicators overlap between multiple targets. And so they are seeking some guidance on that. Like I said, there are this issue of the linkages between the targets and indicators, or between the various targets and the various indicators under them. And so that's something that's going to need to be decided, how those will be brought together. And then how to fill gaps, both in gaps for indicators, for targets that like cultural heritage, that didn't receive a lot of suggestions for what indicators could help measure those targets, but also just gaps more broadly, data gaps, various challenges that would arise when they actually try to use these indicators, and figuring out what will be the process for determining how to measure the indicators in the future, if there's things like a lack of data, or like a lack of consensus around qualitative measurement, for example. The other big discussion will likely be around more procedural discussion related to the elements of what's called paragraph 38 of Decision 2 CMA5. And so some parties have made submissions on this, mostly Global North parties. And this is more how the framework, like outlining the work of under the framework going forward. And so figuring out how they will facilitate an ongoing exchange of knowledge, experience, and information on adaptation, assessing how the GGA will provide inputs for future global stocktakes. So this was a big problem at the last global stocktake, because the GGA wasn't elaborated. There wasn't really a clear mechanism or a clear set of guidelines for how the GGA progress assessment would be included in the global stocktake. They want to enhance understanding. There's an imperative to enhance understanding of risks and impacts under different temperature goals. So sort of figuring out how they're going to do that. If we're going to have 3 degrees of warming versus 2 degrees of warming versus 1 degree of warming, you'll need different levels of adaptation. So kind of working to understand what that will look like. Building again on the best available science, which is a standard under the convention. And then also they'll be tasked with developing a terms of reference for the framework. And I imagine that will end up being a pretty extensive set of negotiations going forward, although I'd have to double check what the timeline for that will be. And that's essentially what to expect at COP29. It's more kind of guidance on the process going forward. And I imagine the work program, the additional 2 workshops for the work program on indicators will be the more exciting places where the GGA is being discussed in the year ahead. And that's all for me. I will hand it off to Axel Michaelowa, who will tell us more about Article 6.
Good. So I hope you can hear me. So First slide, please. So you know that Article 6 international carbon markets were in choppy waters at the last few COPs. So we actually had the situation that we couldn't get an agreement at the Dubai COP for the two carbon market approaches. We only got the agreement on Article 6.8, which was more of a procedural nature, and I won't discuss 6.8 anymore. At subsidiary bodies in summer, we had, of course, some progress on at least understanding the differences, which in Dubai was not always clear. So we got clarity on the issues with regarding the timing, content, and changes to authorization, which of course is crucial to generate the ITMOs, the emission credits under Article 6.2, and also some credits under Article 6.4. So there is a lot of discussion what should be the content of the information that is linked to authorization. Do we need authorization on various levels for the whole approach or just for the credits as such? Can this authorization be done at any time, or is it cut off at a certain point of time? And also, can you actually come back on a decision for authorization and revoke it later? And if yes, under which circumstances? Then the second critical question relates to the registry in which we account for the specific units. So should these registries actually be able to do transactions, or should they just be accounting places and that the transactions would have to be done in the registries that are operated by private sector service providers? Then a topic which is a bit less visible, but of course which will be important for the actual credibility of the Article 6.2 is what happens if there are inconsistency in the data. Can these units still be traded, or will they be blocked? What will happen to them? Then, of course, many parties blocked the so-called agreed electronic format because they thought we cannot decide on this when still important content issues remain open. There was a minor issue with regarding to the terminology, which is often not clear. So the Secretariat will be tasked to draw up a list, but I'm sure that the negotiations will erupt once this list is available. And then, of course, we have had this issue, how to do the corresponding adjustment on the national level. And there are important decisions to be made, but there was consensus to defer it. And there seems to be consensus to defer it by 1 year. Next slide, please. So that means we have the remaining questions on what will be authorized, how will it be done, does it stand forever or can it be changed? Then the definition of what is a first transfer of a credit, because that's important as it triggers this corresponding adjustment, the double bookkeeping. Then we have certain developing countries who say we need capacity building funding, otherwise we don't accept the electronic format. So a typical case of hostage taking of a topic. Then we have this issue of the inconsistency. So does it block the unit or can it still be used? And then, as said, the registry type. Next, please. So with regard to Article 6.4, of course, we have various issues that are directly related to the 6.2 outcomes. So on the registries, on the authorization. So I won't discuss this here now in detail. Then there are terminology issues. There is a term emissions avoidance, which is interpreted in very different ways, but that's important regarding the coverage of activity types. But there was now an agreement that this should be deferred by many years to 2028. And also how to deal with national arrangement for accreditation of the verifiers and validators the methodology and so on. But given that Article 6.4 is a centralized mechanism, it was felt that the national arrangements, are not that important. So also a deferral to 2028. Next, please. So that means the critical issues with regard to Article 6.4 are this, let's say, dependent on the authorization decisions of 6.2 and also the registry decision. There is one specific item which may seem arcane, but which is, in my view, quite important, because under Article 6.4, you can create either ITMOs that have a corresponding adjustment, double bookkeeping, or you can create the so-called litigation contribution units, which are not authorized, which can only be used towards the NDC of the host country. And of course, the latter will be worth much less than the former. So some, especially developing countries, have argued, yeah, you can change these MCUs into ITMOs at a later point in time. But if you have now paid the adaptation tax, the so-called share of proceeds, in form of MCUs, then of course the adaptation fund gets much less money than if it has been paid ITMOs, which have by nature a higher value. And of course, many people fear that this is now a circumvention to reduce the tax, and therefore, especially AOSIS has asked that if there is a change from MCU to ITMO, then also the tax level would have to be adjusted. Then we've had a very important decision by the body that oversees the 6.4 mechanism, the SBM, because it has taken a decision on what was earlier referred to as the guidance for methodologies and removals. Now the supervisory body was a bit fed up by the inability of the COP to decide on this guidance, so it has now taken a gamble. It has redefined this to be a standard. A standard is a type of document that can be decided by the supervisory body mechanism, but still, of course, the COP, or here formerly the CMA, needs to endorse the decision of the 6.4 supervisory body. So now the question is, will the parties actually agree to this a bit overriding of the parties? And of course, there are various relevant content issues in these standards. For example, with regard to the methodologies, it was decided that there shall now be downward adjustment for all three methodology approaches and not just for the historical emissions level. So that's a stringent decision. Similarly, for additionality, it was decided that the test of the investment parameters should be generally required and that the barrier test could only be used under certain circumstances. Again, a relatively stringent decision. So, of course, there are various countries who want to be less stringent. So let's see whether they reopen it. With regard to the removals, which was very contentious in Dubai, they have now taken the decision that there shall be a buffer pool for unavoidable reversals. Unavoidable, of course, still needs to be defined what it exactly means, and that there should be insurance for the avoidable reversals. Of course, we don't know how expensive such insurance will be, whether it will at all be available. So again, I would say a decision which is towards the stringent side. Also, it is stated that the monitoring of the reversals needs to be done until the risk of reversals is negligible. So if I now interpret this in the normal layman approach, it would mean you need to monitor for a very long time. And of course, many project developers will not like this. And again, countries who want to sell a lot of removal credits will not like it. So we need to see to what extent this will now be reopened. Next slide, please. So how does this all relate to the latest developments? It is clear that the COP presidency now has stated several times that it sees the Article 6 as a second priority item after NCQG. They stressed it very strongly in the pre-COP. For example, they had a plenary session on Article 6, and the earlier planning didn't foresee that. In that plenary session, both European Union and United States, which had been antagonistic at Dubai, they stated several times, yeah, we need flexibility and we want to achieve an outcome. We saw a majority of parties clearly stating that they see this methodology and removal standards as good. The only party that specifically said it doesn't like this is Russia. That's surprising because Russia so far has not really been engaged in Article 6 negotiations. And of course, Russia is not known for high environmental integrity positions. I personally think that Russia wants to get a negotiation chip for other topics, but we need to see that. So currently, I think we have probably a good likelihood to get an outcome unless this Russia question gets out of hand, which would, of course, then allow to operationalize Article 6.4 in early 2025 and make, for example, methodology submissions in the first half of that year. Thank you very much. Back to.
Well, thanks, Axel, and thank you to all of our speakers. I am going to invite all of our speakers to come on to video so we can kick off our discussion. And a reminder to everyone to please keep putting questions in the Q&A function. We are getting lots of your questions, and all the panelists have been very busy while others have been presenting on responding to your questions in the Q&A, so make sure to check those out. We'll raise some of them back up again too to let additional panelists comment on them. But to kick us off, you all have shared a lot of specifics on each kind of different agenda item or area that you're following. I'm curious, kind of stepping back, looking across your presentations, what would a successful outcome of COP29 look like to you? You can pick one specific thing, big picture, but Etta, maybe we can start with you and kind of run through the order of presenters, just like when this has wrapped up in the second half of November, what are you hoping to have seen?
Yeah, definitely, Anna. So I think there are two potential options. I think in an ideal world, right, a most ambitious outcome for the NCQG would be something that really centers the needs of developing country parties. So those have been listed in the trillions of dollars annually for just this decade. And so something that would both acknowledge those needs and then find a way to realistically move towards them. I think in the context of what I discussed around the elements and the details of that, that might look like something that would include a strong provisional core, so where there are developed countries coming forward and pledging grants and highly concessional loans to many points that were made during the course of the presentation. You know, those that the definition for that has been yet forthcoming. So, and then I think it would also look like sort of an expansion of the contributor base in some sort of way, whether that might be informal or just truly recognizing South-South flows that what we call the climate finance from developing countries to other developing countries, sort of recognizing the progress that's already been made in that respect, since there is a lot of climate finance that is already provided in that way. And then also, I think it might have to include, you know, adaptation and loss and damage in some way, shape, or form. That's sort of like the ideal scenario. There are also parties talking about not having an outcome, and so in a sort of like least common denominator sort of way, I think it's also just really critical that COP29 includes an outcome on the NCQG, and so wanting to make sure that whatever that might look like, that parties are moving forward towards the climate finance goals and the provision and mobilization sort of requirements that are set out in the Paris Agreement. I think it's really important that COP29 just has a decision on climate finance.
Thank you, and we'll run down the line. So Melissa, over to you next.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I think so apart from the fact that yes, finance is going to be a very big issue this year, I wanted to say that I think for success at COP29, I will be looking out for whether this COP has been inclusive, actually. I think we've seen quite a bit of challenge in the lead up to COP29, particularly on the badges and accommodation. And I really will want to look out for whether the presidency has meaningfully provided opportunities for engagement and action outside of the formal negotiations. So as you know, all of us here, most of us here, I think, are representing observer organizations, and we play such a huge role in educating and raising awareness about the COP, about the negotiations. But I really think, that there should be a more formal role for observers to play, and success at COP29 will need to be one that's collective and is inclusive for all. Thanks.
Jhalak?
Yeah. I can come in now, Anna?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, great. I mean, I would definitely echo what Melissa and Edda have said so far. I mean, in the ideal scenario for it being a successful COP, we definitely should have the finance targets come in. Transparency also is an important aspect. The COP29 presidency has been holding a couple of these events and high-level workshops to actually advance the support towards the BTR. So that would be interesting to see how countries actually come up with that, and also like just advance action towards adaptation and loss and damage. And because I talked about loss and damage, if I talk in terms of the key aspects over there, I mean, there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered over there. I mean, the decisions on certain aspects have been deferred to post-COP. We have the fourth board meeting in December. So a couple of these discussions will be up on the agenda. But this COP, if I particularly talk about, should first focus on scaling up the support, with the presidency calling up for additional pledges. And there are opportunities with the first annual high-level dialogue that they have that'll be happen on the first 2 days. So it'll be important for this dialogue to set that tone and basically just elevate these discussions on enhancing the loss and damage funding arrangements. So one is that. Also, how the coordination between the three key entities for loss and damage also comes into play will be critical. We have the Warsaw National Mechanism, we have the Santiago Network that was operationalized last year, and we now have the Loss and Damage Fund. So how do these three come together and actually deliver on the needs of the developing countries? And lastly, how loss and damage can actually feature under the NCQG, whether it turns to be a thematic focus or whether it's something as a sub-goal. It'll be interesting to see how these pan out in the overall negotiations. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, so I definitely agree with many of the points that have already been made. I think truly the NCQG obviously being the key issue at this COP, and that being a really important element to a successful COP. And I agree with Ida's language that it should be ambitious and also prioritizing the needs of developing countries. I think on adaptation, on the global goal on adaptation, honestly, I'm just hoping for a COP where the issue doesn't become, where like we don't kind of get stuck in the negotiations on something. So even I feel like right now where negotiations are at, and with the work program on indicators, now that it's been sort of decided that indicators will be developed and are actively being developed, it seems like there's sort of a collective like agreement on like the progress, and like that, or like people are kind of like we have a task and everyone's working toward it now. But historically at COPs, especially the GGA negotiations have gotten stuck in really like minor technical points, and have like really dragged out into the second week onto high level negotiate. Like it's always gotten really messy. So I'm kind of hoping for a COP where that sort of just doesn't happen this year. And we'll see what comes up. It's been sort of a surprise each year what sort of stalls the negotiations. Yeah, I also want to kind of echo Melissa's point about inclusivity as well. And I mean, everyone is really looking forward to Belém next year as this like next sort of big COP meeting. And I think really some of the success of this meeting will depend on how well positioned or if we come out of it in a good position to have a very successful and ambitious COP next year. I think really setting ourselves up for success this year will be crucial. And that's going to look a little bit different for each issue, but sort of making sure that the progress that can be made now is made such that next year greater steps can be taken. Thanks.
Yes, I would say that, of course, we need a finance decision. We cannot push the finance decision to Berlin. I would hope that the finance decision is not just redefining climate finance in the sense that we get, for example, to this annual climate policy initiative, 600 billion climate finance redefinition, so that, those parties who don't want to spend more money don't just creatively define numbers that they look big, but in reality mean marching backwards. I hope that we get some new contributors from the rich parts of this world that have not historically been part of what is called developed countries under the convention. These countries need to really take responsibility. I've been working a lot in the Gulf region, and I think they need to take it, and they are reluctant to take it, unfortunately. I think that the presidency now sees an increased risk that they may not be able to conclude the NCQG. That's why they think, oh, Article 6 is now an easier topic. It's less controversial. So we'll have a success if we manage that one and shift the rest to Berlin. But for me, this would not be a success. This would be the minimum work they need to achieve, but not a success. Thank you.
Thanks, Axel, and thanks, everyone. Yeah, the shifting that Article 6 is suddenly the easy thing to accomplish seems like an interesting turn of events in the past couple of years. But my next question that is kind of broadening out one of the questions we got in the Q&A is that you all have mentioned lots of different documents and spreadsheets and trackers. As we go into COP, whether someone is following from home or is on the ground in Baku, what are your recommendations for tips and tricks of how to follow the given issue area that you want to track while you're at COP or while COP's happening? Like, where do you find out about the ministerial level work? Where do you find the right documents? How do you get the in-session documents? Just sort of like any tips and recommendations you have. And I'll just open up, whoever unmutes can jump in and share.
I can say quickly that Carbon Brief the last few years has put out a tracker of documents. I'd have to kind of dig up if there's like a regular link they use for that. But yeah, Carbon Brief has kind of all issues, the most updated documents being put out for each session. If you want to look at the texts that are actually being produced, that'll be a good thing. It's a really good resource. I've used that in past years, even being present at the negotiations.
Thanks, Danielle. Any other tip, Melissa?
Yeah, in addition, I think the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, of course, I think is one of the best ways you can catch up, because obviously you can't be at all places at once. So that's a really great way to sort of download what went on the day before. They also do a really great curtain raiser and end of COP kind of overview. So you definitely want to look out for that. I'm also going to post in the chat shortly the what insiders know as the Grand Reservoir page. And you definitely want to have that on your mobile phone or your browser. It's basically what is shown on the CCTV screens across the COP venue. So that gives you basically like a one-stop shop of all the sessions happening. And I just looked at the dates for Baku, and you can actually see some of the press conferences already listed there. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat shortly. Thanks.
Yeah, just to add, of course, for those who follow NGO positions, ECO always shows what they see as the most relevant. And then there's a Third World Network, which of course reports from a very developing country-centric perspective, but very complete.
Thank you. Yeah, Ada.
I'll just add maybe one more resource that I'm surprised no one has mentioned, but sometimes the Ringo like sort of note sharing has been quite helpful. And I'll also just plug if there are Ringo members who are going to COP, as someone who tends to find that, you know, while the Earth Negotiations Bulletin is wonderful, it is quite high level. So if there are any notes that can be shared, I know that Beth is always keen to get more people sharing notes there. So that's been helpful.
And I'll jump in and say the Ringo's meetings as well are always really helpful if you're present and a Ringo.
And I think we actually know the official time and place and location of those Ringo meetings, so I imagine that'll be shared soon. Beth,
But
did you?
I'm actually going to jump in as not a panelist, but a quick answer to yes, that will be on the Ringo website. But also I will drop the link because the place to get in-session documents is if you go to the online agenda on the UNFCCC page and click through the agenda, not the PDF version, but the online agenda version, and you'll see pre-sessional and in-session documents that are being made available. And that's a really handy place to go to try to see what's been put forth.
Thank you, Beth. So next question, we got a question in the Q&A about how the Loss and Damage Fund is related to the NCQG. And I think we got at that a little bit, but I think it also raises a broader question of how the different issue areas that you all spoke to, and perhaps some we didn't cover, are related to each other and might depend on each other to move forward. And I'm wondering if you could share an example of that comes to mind related to the issue that you presented on, or if you want to dig into more on the Loss and Damage Fund and NCQG connection, welcome to do that as well. But yeah, any thoughts on kind of how these different issue areas relate to each other and how that will impact outcomes at COP29 and beyond?
Yeah, let me come in. Of course, we've seen a lot of discussions. For example, should revenues from carbon market be considered to be part of international climate finance or not? And we've seen the debate about should there be an official definition of international climate finance? And this has been opposed by many because it gives constructive ambiguity then to exchange across various negotiation fields. Thank you.
Yeah, Ada.
Yeah, I might let others come in on sort of the loss and damage pieces in particular. But I think the NCQG is really interesting. And hopefully it came across in that it is sort of linked in many ways to other areas of the Paris Agreement. And if it's not explicitly, then you know, I think we should push, or there should be opportunities for those linkages to be explored further. That's certainly an aspect that's come up in the various technical expert dialogues. So for example, one being the GGA is maybe an area that hasn't necessarily had its data shine within the NCQG, and how it's maybe linked to the adaptation, or sorry, the indicators work program. It's not really at all, and obviously like there are some time mismatches, but I'll also say from the NDC perspective, right, whether or not finance comes forward to support developing countries in their pursuit of their increased ambition in their NDCs is another factor to keep in mind.
Maybe just a quick comment here as well. So on the NCQG and the loss of damage bit, I mean, these are interlinked in some manner. I mean, we have a dedicated fund for loss and damage, but it's also important to reinforce the need for higher financing. If you look at the current numbers as well, I mean, it stands at a few hundred millions, but if you look at the needs, it stands a couple of billions. So how is it that we can truly bridge that gap? And maybe NCQG can be one of those instruments that can play a part to actually support that. And that's where it's a little interlinked, and just looking at different instruments that can actually fill in and provide the money for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the connection between adaptation or the GGA specifically and finance is a tough one because the parties have kind of, since the beginning of these negotiations on elaborating the GGA have really, or developed country parties have really opposed discussing finance in the GGA room, saying it's reserved for the NCQG discussions. And developing country parties have been really pushing to have finance included in the discussions. I was just double checking the decision text from the last COP, and as I remembered, there's like sort of language alluding to the need for more finance, the need to close the adaptation finance gap, encouraging the NCQG rooms to be considering the framework, the UAE framework for enhanced climate resilience. In their discussions, but I think that's still a tie that's pretty tenuous, and it's not clear how GGA and NCQG will directly interact.
Thanks, everyone. We got another question in the chat about the gender action plan and to what extent gender will be a topic covered at COP. And Melissa did provide a written response, but I wanted to raise that and potentially broaden it out as well to say, are there any other issue areas that we haven't covered yet that you want to make sure get mentioned here so that folks know that it's something to keep an eye on at this upcoming COP? So any comments on gender action plan, gender at COP29, or other issues we haven't yet mentioned that are on your radar for Baku? And maybe we can go in the reverse order this time of the panelists. So Axel, we could start with you and give everyone a chance to just give a quick response.
Well, I would just refer to my colleagues. I have no specific point here. Thank you.
I also don't have any really specific other issues that I think the issue of like indigenous and local knowledges has come up in a lot of discussions, and I don't really think has been dealt with substantively. So I'm curious how those discussions progress. And I think, I mean, sort of slightly outside the COP agenda, but like the issue of like activism and engagement in COP spaces and like the types of or the country context in which the COP's been taking place the last few years. I'm curious to see kind of the level of activist engagement, I guess, and like outside pushing of the negotiations that happens.
Yeah, I think I'm not particularly following this negotiation item, but maybe just transition might be something that might be spoken of. Not really following that in detail, but how the work program pans out and what that's something might be interesting to look at. But yeah, I think largely everything has been covered so far. Yeah, so maybe.
Yeah, and following from that, I think we haven't quite mentioned the global stocktake and the follow through from last year's agreement in the first global stocktake. It kind of seems to have fallen off the agenda. I don't know if it's strange or not, but I hope that parties will take it seriously enough to see a follow through from some of the key outcomes of the GST targets and signals that were raised last year at COP28 or agreed last year at COP28.
Yeah, no,
Sorry,
I think
just talk. Sorry.
No, I was
Eda,
just,
please come.
thanks, Axel. No, I think no, to echo Melissa, I think the global stocktake is really the only one that we're following closely. But outside of these, granted, there are many new topics that have been introduced to the COP, and I think like food and agriculture, for example. But in particular, we just curious to see where mitigation lands within the agenda, and if we can continue to take it forward.
Axel, final word for you.
Just to comment that, of course, global stocktake elements influence the mitigation work program discussion. But we see the emergence of the old divide, developing countries, developed countries, because each picks the elements from the global stocktake that fit to their own position. That's unfortunate because it shows that there was no real UAE consensus.
Thanks to all our panelists. I think given that we have 1 minute left, we will wrap up. So Thank you so much for your presentations and engagement in the discussion, and thank you to our audience for lots and lots of great questions. This has been recorded, so if you want to go back and watch it again or share it with your colleagues, feel free to do so. It will be posted on the Second Nature website within a couple days and also linked on the RINGO website. As Beth mentioned at the top, there are also 2 other webinars that were done, I believe, 2 years ago on kind of 101 on UNFCCC negotiation process and structure, engaging with the UNFCCC and the COPs and the subsidiary bodies. So go back and check those out, even though recorded a little while back, they still have enormous amounts of valuable information that can help to inform your time in Baku if this is your first COP, especially. During COP, the RINGO website is a great place to go. You heard the notes mentioned, you heard the morning meetings mentioned. All are welcome to join us and engage in those conversations. We'll have many presentations that will be very similar to kind of these updates that you got today during those meetings as well. So please join us, and information about that, as Beth mentioned, will be posted soon on the RINGO website. And I'm sure that is being dropped in the chat so that you know where to find us. Most of the folks on this webinar are also going to be putting out useful information in the lead up to and during COP. So keep an eye on the websites of the organizations that are represented on this panel today. Just a final thank you to Second Nature, University Climate Change Coalition, RINGO Constituency Group. We had a whole host of folks behind the scenes that made this webinar possible today. So many thanks to them. Thank you again for joining us, and I think we will leave it there for today. Thank you, and we'll see you in Baku. Bye, everyone.